So good morning. My name is Jonathan Zittrain, and on behalf of the Oxford Internet Institute and our good colleagues at the University of Toronto Citizen Lab, the Harvard University Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and the University of Cambridge Advanced Network Research Unit at the Cambridge Security Program, we welcome you to the predicate of this sentence. We're delighted to be here today, and we're delighted that you can be here to contribute to and share part of our launch of really the first set of broad-based, rigorous academic studies of internet filtering worldwide. This is just the beginning of an in-depth project that will continue for a number of years, and we'll be adjusting as we go. And we look forward to being able to share with you some of the subtleties, the nuance, the surprises, and even the basics that we found, and to offer many ways to contribute to the project, to stay in touch, and to help shape it. The internet was founded without a whole lot of measurement built in. Measurement is sort of unnecessary overhead. And it's different from many other networks in that respect. If you ask T-Mobile how many subscribers do you have, this is an answer that they know, probably down to the second. If you ask America Online how many subscribers do you have, adjusting for the number of CD-ROMs that they're dropping out of helicopters at any given moment and signing new people up, they can tell you as well. If you even ask BBC or CNN how many subscribers do you have, despite the fact that their model of distributing content is hurling it into the airwaves where any properly tuned television or filling in a molar can catch it, even they, through institutes like the A.C. Nielsen Company that you may have passed on the way into Oxford, right past the park and ride, can tell you how many they have. You try to ask the internet how many subscribers do you have, and there's no internet to ask, and there's no answer forthcoming. We can have some sense of how many IP addresses have been allocated, but just ask the state of, I believe, is it Yemen, that tends to share one IP address among everyone in the country. This absence of measurement has been generally a blessing for the internet. It has meant that it can expand without people trying to figure out at that moment who's supposed to pay whom for what. It's led to some counterintuitive results as people sit down at a table, network engineers, to figure out, I've got a bunch of traffic for you, you've got a bunch of traffic for me, so well, how should we pay each other? And the answer for many years has been, I don't know, let's just swap and call it even. It's these kinds of features that have meant that we really haven't had a good sense of the pulse and warp and weave of the internet as it has exploded. We have been the beneficiary and, more recently, I believe, the victim of what you might call the procrastination principle. Don't design the perfect network for anticipated uses now. Build a little bit and see what happens. And then others can build more. And before you know it, it will go somewhere. I think this is why a network with absolutely no content deals, with no CEO, and with no business plan has managed to subsume and outpace what in the mid-1990s we thought were vying to be the world's networks, the proprietary nets like AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, for those from France, Minitel. Yeah, some knowing chuckles about Minitel. So I think we're at a stage now where, akin somewhat to global warming, our capacity to affect the digital environment has outstripped our ability to measure what's going on, and if it's not so good, what to do about it. We have very tightly coupled networks in some respects right now, and what I think to many of us in the room seems comparative freedom is something that is in motion, as our studies will show, and something that 5, 10, 15 years down the line could lead us to a very, very different configuration for our experience of the network and the content on it and the people we might interact with through it. I'm even mindful of the blandishments we've all received this morning from St. Anne's College. Please note that the network is monitored continuously, and any illegal activity results in a machine being disconnected. If you can get on in the first place. The most secure network, just like the most secure bank, is the one whose doors are chained shut. Notice the use of the passive voice in that sentence. Now, as you may have noticed, I'm an American, even though I'm over here, and the passive voice is used frequently in Britain. Right? I'm getting good at it. The network is monitored continuously. This raises certain follow-up questions. By whom? Illegal to whom? And the machine being disconnected. The idea of this is the internet death penalty. They need threaten no more but a disconnected machine. And all of us have been at conferences where it does feel like a certain penalty when one's internet connection is cut off. So all of this is to say that there is news here, there is stuff to study here, and the university and the foundations of the world, what we might call among our generic top-level domains, the .coms and the .orgs, the .edus and the .orgs. What a Freudian slip. The .edus and the .orgs have a crucial role to play in providing the kind of measurement and insight that this network has so far blessedly, naively not needed. I think one message of what you're about to hear today is that it does. And we're here to provide it, we're here to discuss the implications, and we welcome you for that. So with that said, I think we should cut right to sort of the unveiling of our results. Our order of battle for the morning is Professor Ron Diebert from the Citizen Lab will discuss the basics of our findings. We'll have chances for question and answer after that. Then it will go over to Professor John Palfrey to talk about what's coming next in the afternoon sessions. We're probably going to rearrange some of the breakout sessions in round one. Free expression on the internet and human rights in cyberspace may be putting too fine a distinction on some of things. So for those of you not sure which to attend, I think you can celebrate that you'll be attending the same thing together. And we may announce a third Dark Horse wildcard breakout session, likely about distributed applications and other specialized tools for doing the kinds of measurement that I've claimed are so necessary in this next round of non-naive internet growth. So with that, let me again welcome you and turn it over to Professor Ron Diebert. Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming and welcome to the first ONI Woodstock without the drugs so far. As Jonathan said, I'm going to be introducing the findings by giving a brief overview of the structure and methodology of the ONI, and then I'm going to be turning over to a couple of my colleagues, Nart Villenuve from the Citizen Lab and Rob Faris from the Berkman Center to put some flesh to the details of what we found in our very interesting research over the last year and even going back further. The OpenNet Initiative was created in 2002. Some of us had been working on research in this area for a few years earlier, and we realized that there was a commonality of aims and approaches. We got together and decided that we wanted to work collectively to document patterns of internet censorship and surveillance worldwide. At the time, and even today to some degree, I think there is a conventional wisdom most people have that the internet is one seamless global environment, a network of networks. We realized, and I think our research bears this out very much, that in fact it is not. There are many points along the internet's underbelly where authorities can intervene and intercept and monitor communications. And I think this is happening increasingly slow as states recognize the geopolitical importance of the internet. And so what we wanted to do was to unearth what was going on beneath the surface and shed some light on state activities, state interventions into cyberspace. The big challenge at the outset was to develop a credible methodology because there were many reports of internet censorship worldwide, but many of them tended to be inconsistent. They tended to be denied by states. And what we wanted to do was bring to bear a very credible methodology that blended contextual information, in other words, in-field research gathered by people who live in the countries under investigation and know the context well, blend that expertise, that local expertise, with tests that we carry out through advanced technical means, which I'll talk about more in a few moments. So our analysis is a blend of expert, in other words, qualitative research and statistical quantitative methods that is derived from our advanced technical testing, our network interrogation activities. The structure of the OpenNet Initiative is very interesting in and of itself, and I just recently completed a chapter for a book on political networks talking about the structure and the methodology of the OpenNet Initiative. It's certainly the most interesting project I've been involved in my career so far. At the center of the OpenNet Initiative are 4 universities who form a partnership, each of which tends to take a slightly different functional role. So I'd like to spend a few moments just describing the partnership. We have, of course, the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, which is primarily responsible for a lot of the legal analysis that the OpenNet Initiative undertakes and a lot of the open source information processing and the management and coordination of this enormous enterprise in and of itself. And I'd just like to single out Rob Faris, who this year played a heroic role as really the quarterback and captain of the ONI's research efforts. And the rest of the team at Berkman, Colin, Seth, Catherine, everybody over there who plays such an essential role in the project, and without whom this really couldn't take place. We have at Cambridge an expertise around field research and deep field research, network contextual analysis that includes really 2 units, the Advanced Network Research Group led by our colleague who couldn't be here today, Rafał Rohozinski, whose wife just gave birth to their first son, so he's back home in Ottawa tending to domestic matters. But he's a critical part of this operation and, again, essential part of the OpenNet Initiative. And the Cambridge unit also includes Stephen Murdoch and Ross Anderson, some of the best and brightest people involved in computer science programming and network interrogation that's essential for our research. Of course, here at Oxford is my colleague Jonathan Zittrain, and he's moved over here from Berkman, responsible for a lot of the advanced policy research that we undertake, and he's working on a distributed application that will be, we hope, an important part of the ONI's testing regime, and Jonathan's going to be talking a bit about that in some of the breakout sessions later this afternoon. And I direct the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, and we're primarily responsible for the development and the production of the testing tools that we use at the center of our technical testing effort. We also are responsible for some of the research into circumvention technologies, and we recently released a software tool called Siphon that some of you may have heard about that helps people get around internet censorship. So at the center of the ONI is this partnership among these 4 universities, but it doesn't end there. In fact, the OpenNet Initiative couldn't take place were it not for the participation of literally dozens of non-governmental organizations, activists, and individuals worldwide that we collaborate with in an informal and formal basis to undertake the research that we do. These people cooperate with us, often at great personal risk, to undertake the research that we do, to carry out the tests that we do from behind national firewalls within countries that we're investigating. And they're very much an integral part of the collaboration. The methodology of the OpenNet Initiative is really quite unique. As I said at the outset, it is a blend of technical intelligence and qualitative research undertaken by people within the countries under investigation. And the technical interrogation is something that we've refined continuously over the last 5 years. Some of the tools that we use are very standard tools that are used by system administrators, hackers, criminals, and spies. Here we've reoriented them for civil society / academic purposes. Other tools we've developed ourselves over the years. These are homegrown tools that we use to determine blocking patterns, to assess where filtering is taking place in a country. Is it happening at the internet service provider from which we're connecting to? Is it happening at the internet cafe? Is it happening at the backbone level, or is it some combination of these? Or at the college level at St. Anne's. Is there some particular technology that's being used to determine the filtering? We've, over time, developed ways to, in essence, gather fingerprints of commercial filtering software that's used to carry out the filtering. But the technical interrogation, although it tends to get the spotlight in terms of what the ONI does, is only one part of the puzzle. The contextual research is as essential. We need to know from people who understand the context, the social, political, economic context of each of the countries under investigation, what the dynamics are within that country. What are the issues that are of concern to the government in those countries? What is likely to be targeted for filtering that may not seem obvious or apparent upon first glance? And so the in-field researchers are the people that really target the technical testing and help us refine what it is that we're going to focus on when we do our research. And of course, they help us in terms of the interpretation of the results. The technical testing in and of itself really only tells you a slice of what's going on. To understand why the filtering is occurring, you have to speak to people who live in these countries. At the center of the ONI's testing efforts are, of course, lists, categorized baskets of URLs and keywords and IP addresses that we run over an extended period of time within all of the countries under investigation, across all of the internet service providers in the countries under investigation. At least that's our gold standard. We try to do that in every country we test in. Some of them, of course, we fall short of that standard because of particular circumstances in those countries. Putting together the lists in and of themselves is an enormous enterprise. There are over 20 languages used in the construction of the lists that we use to undertake the testing that we did, and these inform the research investigations that we carry out as part of our country investigations. Let me talk a bit about how the interrogation of the internet works. I've said before that what we do is essentially lift the lid on the internet, and I like that metaphor because, again, most people, I think, don't think much about what happens to the information that they request beyond their computer screen in front of them. And what we aim to do is actually dig down beneath the subterranean layers of the internet and understand what's happening beneath the surface, often in secret, in unaccountable ways. So there are a suite of tools that we use in our research, and Nart will talk more about our methods in a few moments, but I'll just give you a brief overview of the interrogation spectrum to give you an idea of the type of technical tests that we do. At a most basic level, one of the things that we will do is undertake a remote probe, and by that I mean we'll connect two computers inside the countries under investigation and use them as proxies, typically from either the Berkman Center or Cambridge or Citizen Lab. These are remote interrogations that we use only as a first cut attempt to understand what's going on. We may get a report that a website is banned in a particular country, and what we'll do is we'll connect to a proxy and run some initial tests. It can tell you a few things, but not a lot. There are limitations to this method. I'll just give you an example. This is a trace route of a request for Human Rights Watch website. And what we did was do a trace route of our connection from a computer in Beijing Feihua Communications Technology Center in Beijing. And we made a request for humanrightswatch.org. And you can see from this trace route that it makes its way all the way to ChinaNet Backbone Network, which is hop 7. And at that point, the request stops. So just from this preliminary probe, we can tell something's going on beneath the surface. The request for Human Rights Watch is not making it past hop 7 at the Backbone Network. So there must become some kind of blockage going on within China to prevent that request from going through, especially because we check in the Citizen Lab or elsewhere that we can get to the Human Rights Watch website, so we know there's nothing wrong with the website itself. But there are limitations to this type of technique. What we do going further is equip people who work with us with a suite of network interrogation tools. Typically, these are applied in two ways. One is to have people who are traveling to the country or live in the country come to the Citizen Lab, where we equip their laptops with these tools, and when they get to the country, they plug in their computer, and the tests run more or less in an automated fashion. They check simultaneously for accessibility to websites from within the country and a computer that we set up in a control location in Canada. So if we see that the request is getting through in Canada, but not in the country under investigation, well, that tells us that something is up. The portable tools are useful, they're very flexible, but going further, what we aim to have are in-country black boxes, quote unquote. These are computers that we install that are in the country that we have 24/7 access to, that allow us to control the computers remotely as if we were there and run a whole suite of network interrogation activities. I'm going to end it there and turn it over to my good colleague Nart Villeneuve from the Citizen Lab, who's going to talk about some more details about the methodology and some of the unique patterns we found in the filtering before Rob gets into some of the results. So Nart?
So we tested in about 40 countries/regions, and for us, that's actually, on the technical side, a little bit more difficult because we actually tested over 120 internet service providers in total. And what we do is we test for approximately a week, connecting to these websites using our testing tools, and our goal is to identify and test for a consistent filtering behavior. So the sites that we count as blocked are sites that were 100% inaccessible during that testing period. One of the limitations that's brought up is sites that are only temporarily inaccessible or temporarily blocked. In this study, what we did was we counted any site that was accessible during that time frame as accessible. After conducting our tests, all the anomalous results are investigated further through network metrics, but often manually, to ensure that what we're seeing is actually intentional blocking, so we can differentiate it from possible errors. One of the observations that we noticed is that there were some instances of considerable variation across internet service providers, but in other cases there was quite an outstanding uniformity across quite a number of internet service providers. Often this corresponds to regimes that implement a centralized form of filtering. So at central locations, the filtering takes place, and all the internet service providers have to pass through those gateways, in which case you expect uniformity amongst the ISPs. Whereas in some countries, filtering responsibility is just delegated to the internet service providers, and they choose the means and methods for what to block. Sometimes they even choose what to block, or are given only vague instructions and interpret that and try to figure out what websites certain topic areas would correspond to. But sometimes we see that internet service providers, even though they're using different technology and vague instructions, actually block quite a bit of the exact same amount of content. One really interesting case was in Myanmar, or Burma. There's two state-owned internet service providers, but one filtered a lot more than the other, which was quite interesting for us. One focused solely on sites that had the word Burma in the domain name, and opposition groups and dissident groups and so forth, while the other extended it to cover more social areas like pornography and dating and so forth. Another interesting case was in the United Arab Emirates, where the main internet service provider filters fairly heavily, while one special internet service provider that services the Dubai Dubai Free Zone was completely unfiltered. There wasn't any filtering at all. So it's a case where there's a country with two completely different levels of internet access. Another interesting case for us was Uzbekistan, where we actually tested 5 internet service providers, and there was very high uniformity among them. Whereas last year when we tested, we found that some internet service providers didn't filter at all. So sometime over that year, they really focused on getting all of the internet service providers to block the same kind of content. And another interesting case was South Korea, where despite different blocking behavior between the 2 main internet service providers, they pretty much blocked the exact same content. The techniques that were used for filtering varied quite a bit. The most common was IP blocking. This involves configuring routers, and in some cases, countries that have proxy systems, they can configure the proxies to block IPs as well. But blocking IPs in the routers is usually the first way that countries new to filtering start blocking, because it's something that is fairly simple to do. The internet service providers don't need to buy any new equipment, and it's pretty effective. You're just blocking all of the content on that host. But the problem is that when you block a single IP address, you block all of the websites that are hosted on that content. So it leads to considerable overblocking. So some countries that were pretty new to filtering that blocked by IP were countries such as Ethiopia and Libya, where they just blocked a few IPs. But a really good example is actually Pakistan, where they block IPs at the International Gateway Exchange. So IP blocking affects all of the ISPs that route through that exchange. And they decided to block some blogs on Blogspot. And Pakistan is an interesting case because the ISPs leaked the blocking lists. So this is one of the few cases where we actually know what they wanted to block, as opposed to testing large amounts of URLs, trying to figure out what content areas they're targeting. We actually know what they were targeting. And in the case of Blogspot, there was a couple of blogs that were hosting cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that they wanted to block. But they blocked the IP for Blogspot, so they blocked the whole thing, all of the blogs on Blogspot. And actually this kind of backfired against them, because now there's a big movement in Pakistan against internet censorship of people who were not political in the first place, but just wanted to update their blogs. The other technique that we see is DNS tampering. So once there's some pushback coming from users and advocacy organizations talking about the fact that all of this content that was never intended to be blocked in the first place is being blocked, they try to look at other easy ways or simple ways to just target the content that they want. And what they generally do is configure the DNS servers not to resolve particular domain names to the proper IP address. So in that case, for example, they could block an individual Blogspot blog or an individual domain, as opposed to all of the domains on a single IP. And I've seen up to tens of thousands of domain names hosted on one single IP address. One really interesting case was one ISP in South Korea, which resolved the domain names for pro-North Korean sites to a police website that informed you that you were accessing illegal content, and then displayed your IP address to you and said, by the way, we know who you are. It was a rather intimidating page. And the other interesting thing that we saw in Pakistan is that there's actually overlapping layers of filtering. So although they were blocking the IP address of Blogspot at the gateway level, some of the individual ISPs were also tampering with DNS, and they weren't resolving it to a valid IP address. And one possible explanation for this is that when the ISPs can demonstrate that they can competently block the content the government wants them to block, perhaps they'll remove the IP blocking at the gateway level. The other method that we see is URL filtering. That's generally countries that use a proxy-based or commercial filtering system to block URLs. Generally, they just block the root URL, the domain, with the path of a slash. But sometimes they'll block a full long path URL. In Saudi Arabia, for example, the main pages of the Arab Human Rights Information Network are accessible, but the specific Saudi pages are blocked. Another interesting use of that kind of blocking are countries like United Arab Emirates and Syria, which block all websites that end in .il, or the Israeli ccTLD, all of them. In these countries, unlike countries that block by IP address, users are usually given a block page, or a page that tells you that you've been intentionally blocked. Sometimes the block page even tells you how they've categorized the website. So sometimes you can differentiate between websites that are blocked because they appear on a commercial filtering list and websites that have been added by the local ISP or government. Often there's a user-defined category or some kind of local category that tips you off that it's not a result of smart filters blocking, but it's a result of an intentional URL added to a list. And the other issue about using the commercial filtering software is that these companies often make mistakes. So content that was never intended to be blocked in the first place by these countries gets blocked for all of their citizens because of a classification error made by a commercial filtering company. The other thing that we see is that keywords in HTTP headers, or the information sent by your browser to a web server, can be filtered. Usually, this is done to target search engines. So when you search for the word sex, for example, in Yemen, you won't get any results, you'll get a block page. Because when you search in Google, that word gets appended to the URL path in the browser, and that triggers the filtering. But the most interesting case of keyword filtering actually is in China, where their keyword filtering is actually bidirectional. So you can trigger it with requests into China, and you can trigger it from requests out of China. And what they do is, if a keyword appears in the HTTP header, so in the URL path or in the host header, which sends the domain name, they send you back a reset packet and a reset packet to the host you're trying to access, and that severs your connection to that website. And as a corollary of their blocking, they send out a few more for a while, which prevents you from accessing that content again. That's why if you try to search in Google, for example, for a banned keyword, you'll be blocked. If you try to search for something again, even if it would be normally an accessible keyword, it'll still appear like you're blocked. So that's why oftentimes there's errors when people are reporting what kind of keywords are blocked, because if you search in Google for a banned word, you get blocked. You hit your back button, your cached page of Google appears. You search again for an unblocked word, and it'll appear to be blocked. So you have to be really careful in trying to determine what they're exactly up to. So that's the broad range in general of the types of filtering that we're dealing with. And essentially what we do is we try to figure out what kinds of these filtering techniques each internet service provider is using. And then when we figure that out, then we run through the massive list, as Ron mentioned, where we try to determine what kind of content areas are being specifically targeted. And that's what Rob will tell you all about.
Wonderful to be here today, and thank you all for coming out to join us today to listen to what we have to say and join the dialogue on this topic of growing importance. I'm going to show today a few slides that summarize our findings in a few maps, which you can see in more detail on OpenNet.net. This is it's the summary of a tremendous amount of work by dozens of researchers around the world, so it's quite an honor to be able to stand up here and present this to you today. This is principally the results of the empirical studies which look at technical means to filter. And this is, of course, only one way in which to limit content of what people see and what people do and what people post on the internet. This is a strategy that's applied principally to internet content that is hosted outside of these countries. There's much better ways, there are more effective ways to stifle information within one's borders. It could be a knock on the door, you can pull the plug, you could send a takedown message from a lawyer saying, remove this information from the internet, or else. You could monitor and carry out surveillance of what people are doing on the internet, or you could just provide the impression that you're being watched. All of these things will have a chilling effect and induce self-censorship of internet activity. As Nart and Ron had suggested, we tested in over 40 countries that involved empirical testing in well over 100 ISPs. In each one of those ISPs, we tested in the neighborhood of a couple thousand websites to check to see what was blocked and what was not blocked. This produces a tremendous amount of information, and then what we're trying to do here is present this information, to reduce this information into an understandable scale and one that's accurate as well. So in order to do so, we've divided up internet content into 4 thematic areas. This first one is political content, which reflects human rights, free expression, and material in opposition of the current government in a country. You can see the hot spots for this. There are a number of countries which we've listed as pervasive filterers of political content on the internet. Those include China and Burma and Vietnam and Tunisia, and a list of 7 countries there. You can also see in this map where we've tested in the past year. This is a beginning. This is a first year of a multi-year project. We will expand in future years. We chose these 40 countries as places where we felt we had the most to learn in this given year. This map shows filtering of content and security-related material. The examples of this would be extremist groups, separatist groups, or border conflicts. The countries that filter to the greatest degree here include China filtering material related to Taiwan or Tibet, or Pakistan filtering material related to the Balochi independence movement there, or South Korea filtering material related to North Korea, and vice versa. This map shows social filtering. So this covers content such as drugs, alcohol, gambling, materials of a sexual nature. You can see that the spread of filtering covers a much wider swath of the world in doing so. Some of the results presented here are the results of secondary data and from other known sources. You can see that there's filtering in North America, South America. It's starting to hit sub-Saharan Africa, and it's prevalent in Europe as well as Australia. The final topic here is one of internet tools. This is a somewhat different topic here in set of websites that are blocked. This includes email servers, hosting services, logging services. It also includes circumvention software used to end around the censors, in effect. This map in itself might be seen as a proxy for the seriousness of the filtering regimes in closing loopholes, and is a measure of to what lengths these countries are willing to go to shut down access to these things. Where circumvention materials are available, then the technologically proficient can get around the censors very easily. Where they attempt to shut them down, they're saying, we really don't want anyone to watch this stuff. So that's the global reach of these 4 major thematic areas. The last thing I want to do quickly is to show you how they overlap across the given countries. You can see a reasonable spread of different strategies around the world. These are, of course, very different topics. The social filtering in the yellow circle is those things which we say are bad for children. They shouldn't gamble, they shouldn't look at materials related to drugs and sex and alcohol. So for the good of the children of the country, we're going to block this stuff. The lower circle, security conflict related, has a much different rationale. That is that the security of the motherland is at stake if we don't block these areas. The political filtering, of course, is much more difficult to explain, and if you want to know why it's filtered, then you should probably come in for an interview with us, and we'll talk to you about it. You would think that countries might focus on different topics more selectively, and that the social filtering would be reserved for the countries that have deeply held moral sentiments, and that the security and conflict would be related to countries where they're undergoing a civil war or something, and that the political filtering would be reserved to only the most heavily politically repressive countries in the world. However, we see that there's a cluster of states right in the middle. This suggests the slippery slope of internet filtering, which is once that you go to the trouble of putting in the administrative and the technical and the legal means to filter the internet, that apparently the temptation is out there to leak out and filter a lot of different materials here. I'm going to show one last slide before opening up things for questions for all of us, which is that the missing element in this diagram is that there's a lot of diversity in the intensity of filtering. There's a number of countries here that have only dabbled in internet filtering, blocking a very small number of sites. Singapore, for example, has a symbolic list of 100 pornographic websites that they block. Azerbaijan has blocked a few politically related sites in the past year. Jordan blocks one site, which is a political parody site. India and Morocco focus on a small number of sites. India is devoted to Hindu extremist sites. Morocco to sites supporting independence for Western Sahara. When you remove those, or you at least reduce the prominence of them, you see that those countries that are substantially filtering the internet are covering a lot of area. This research, of course, is the end of 1 year, and this is the year 2007, and we're very curious where this is going to go. I think that in the future, one might expect that these concentric circles are going to be populated by many more countries. Perhaps not. They might move around inside there as well. But the questions that our research produces it's much greater than the answers at this point. So I want to open things up now and keep things open. Would you like to follow up in any way?
No, I only want to open up the questions.
Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you for that.
All right. Can we this for a map or whatever?
I'd love to, good morning. I'm John Palfrey from the Berkman Center, and on behalf also of the group, I want to thank you for being here. My colleagues Ron and Nart and Stephen Murdoch, would you mind actually coming up? Where's Stephen? I saw him somewhere. If willing, Stephen, come up to the front. We'd love to start off a discussion and encourage questions from all over. Sir, okay, that's good. Let's do the microphone though, so that we can be recorded. Adam and Art, this will work. Catherine's got a microphone. Great, that would be wonderful if you could. I'm going to start down here. We've got a few questions.
Mine is trivial. The maps are great. How do you get? Oh, sorry. My name's Yorick Wilkes at the OII. How do you get to no evidence from being a brown country? I mean, Russia, for example, is no evidence. I mean, surely brown must mean no evidence, or is there something like just being a general bad guy that you get to no evidence? Did you see the point of the question?
Did I show previous here?
Do you see the point of the question? No evidence to me means no evidence. So how can you have brown states?
The The gray states are those areas of the world in which we did not test.
I see. So it doesn't just mean no evidence. It means
It's a very important point, is that that does not mean that there's not filtering, suppression of internet activity there, but we did not test in the past year. But thank you for the question and clarification.
Deibert, just as an example here, has identified himself. We'd encourage you to be on the record and say who you are and your name and affiliation and so forth. If you care not to, it is being recorded and we put on the web for posterity and webcast and podcast and all kinds of casts. So you're welcome not to identify yourself, but we'd love if you did and encourage questions of all sorts. A couple more down here.
Damien Tambini, London School of Economics and Associate at the OII. I think this is actually a very big point, this no testing point, which it's fairly important to make clear. But my related point is about the slippery slope arguments, which you alluded to in this very final presentation. On the social content, obviously, countries like the one we're sitting in are involved in, I believe, IP blocking of illegal child porn sites, etc. Can you say a little bit more about the technical links between the kinds of software which is used in this form of blocking and whether there is, in a sense, a learning curve or even an international market in the kinds of software which is being used here and elsewhere?
It's a great question, David. I'd urge both Nart and Stephen to give a comment on this, if you would, just given respective kinds of work.
Sure. Well, the BT filtering system is proprietary. Not that much is known about it. I think Stephen knows a lot more about the specifics of that system than me. But what we are seeing is that a lot of countries are starting to purchase commercial filtering technologies. They start out by blocking IPs, but you can do that with any router. But once they realize that that is not the best method for continuing to expand their filtering, they generally will move to a commercial filtering product with a bunch of cache servers. We see quite similar setups in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Tunisia, and Sudan, all using Smart Filter, which is a product by an American company called Secure Computing, and Netcache cache servers. That gives them the ability to block, especially in social content areas, a lot of content without having to collect it themselves. So they use it a lot for pornography, but also for any kind of proxying systems, like blocking sites like anonymizer.com or systems like Siphon and Tor and others, because if you don't block those, then really your blocking can be circumvented pretty easily. But what's really interesting, and we haven't seen it in use yet, is that these filtering companies now have a wonderful category called advocacy groups and nonprofit organizations. Yeah, in quotations.
Academic matter.
We haven't seen it actually used by any countries yet, but now with a simple checkbox tick, you can block all the major human rights organizations if you choose to.
Stephen Murdoch from the security group at the University of Cambridge Computer Lab.
Nart did a very good job of explaining the technology, but going back to the original question of the slippery slope, a lot of these technologies are very expensive. IP blocking, less so, but as soon as you go to proxies or anything more sophisticated, you have to invest quite a lot of money. But once you've done that, actually adding things to this list is fairly cheap. Not free, but on average, your system will be able to handle a lot more URLs or keywords than it actually is at the moment. So this means that once the system has actually been purchased, it's quite easy for the authorities or lobbying groups to say, well, why don't you add these extra things? And every country has some buzzword or some issue that is so abhorrent to the population that there is no discussion about it. So in the UK it's child pornography, China, some religious groups. And that point can be used to purchase the equipment, and then it's actually fairly easy to persuade the authorities to add extra things onto this list.
Awesome. Ron Diebert wants to make a follow-up.
Just a quick point about commercial filtering software. In cases where it's used in countries that are democratically challenged or non-democratic countries, you have really a double blind of lack of accountability, because the countries themselves don't tend to admit what it is they're filtering. They tend to cover it up. And the commercial filtering software treats the lists of banned websites as proprietary information, a trade secret. So for citizens in those countries where these software tools are being used, they're in effect doubly blinded from what is being prevented to them from accessing information. So this is a big public policy issue.
As with any good internet conference, the expertise is often in the crowd. I don't know, Richard, would you care to comment on those questions, just given your work in this area?
I'll say something.
Excellent. Catherine, would you mind?
I think it's worth noting that it is on, right? I think it's worth noting that a lot of this measurement stuff and so forth works at the moment because the people who are doing the filtering allow it to work, or can't be bothered to try and detect the people who are measuring their systems in order to see whether or not something is going wrong. If you are a very sophisticated country, it would be quite possible to pick out what is being measured and allow that to work differently. There are related problems here. We regularly hear about opposition groups whose websites crash mysteriously next to the election. Last time I heard about that, it was in Connecticut. Right? And basically the problem there was that the people had bought a web server at the end of a piece of wet string which couldn't cope with more than 3 people looking at it. So there are a lot of real technical challenges here, and the internet is a far from consistent thing, right? And therefore, I think this work is is very well done, but I think there's a big caution here, which is that there is a big assumption here, which is that nobody's interfering with the work, and secondly, there's an assumption that it is being done carefully enough in all countries that you are not making confusion between one effect and another effect.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent
Can I
point.
just quickly respond to that? Richard's absolutely right. In fact, the biggest challenges we have in the coming years are what we refer to as event-based filtering, where in some of the countries that we're studying, the internet appears to be relatively open. Our tests don't indicate any evidence of filtering. But what we've noticed is that during special periods, like elections or during demonstrations, there's tampering with the internet that doesn't show up in terms of the type of metrics that we use to measure accessibility. It's much more of a challenge for us in those type of circumstances, and we're hypothesizing that those types of event-based filtering methods are going to become more common in the future, so you're absolutely right.
And before we take another question, just to sort of a substantive response to this cluster of questions on 2 fronts. One is, it is easiest for us to describe the original form of internet filtering, right, which is Saudi Arabia says we're going to block pornography. You go there, a site tells you it's going to be blocked, it is blocked, you get the page. That we can tell clearly, and that's sort of the easy stuff. It's been relatively easy to do that well for 5 years. Where it's trickier and where the kinds of things that these questions lead to are places like the United States and Canada and the UK and so forth, where there's not the standard technical filtering, but of course there's technical filtering at many levels of the network. And how do we describe that with the same level of detail? And secondly, how do you do it in these just-in-time circumstances? So we've now done monitoring of 3 elections, one in Belarus, one in Kyrgyzstan, most recently in Nigeria, and you get some really interesting stories in those periods. We would love to see this work put into not just our research methods, but into the election monitoring process that everybody uses, for instance, in these key moments. So we don't claim to have the answer in all of these cases, and we recognize severe limitations, both based on time and various things happening in the network, even with this first set of very comprehensive results. So,
Tom Hannon from BBC World Service Future Media. I was just wondering, from the legal point of view, if you are a company in the UK that is in charge of filtering out illegal websites, presumably to generate that list and to know where those sites are, you must have to access those sites, which must be illegal. So how does that work, and has anyone considered that within their work? Do you know?
Stephen, I think you have talked on this topic before, right?
I could answer, or I could forward it to Richard, who is the expert in this area.
I think we should go to the real expertise.
Definitely.
Do you mind ceding the microphone for a moment? I promise we'll get back to you. For Richard's question.
Right, the position in the UK, and in fact the list is shared with all sorts of people as well, is that the Internet Watch Foundation gets reports from the general public on our hotline, and then some experts just outside of Cambridge go and look at the websites, form their own view as to whether or not they are illegal. If they are illegal, then they gather technical data about them and pass them to the police, either in the UK, though that's very rare these days, or via Interpol to the correct police force in the correct part of the world when an attempt is made to remove the material. The list is then circulated generally in an encrypted form, and one of the features of BT's system is they claim never to look at the list. They just take it encrypted and decrypted on the black box, which actually does the work, and then the material is then blocked by whichever system is being used by the particular ISP or cable company or whatever it is in the UK. Those lists are also shared with a number of the commercial filtering companies who pay money to IWF in order to get those lists, and then they're built into their software. Those lists are also shared with the hotlines in other countries and so forth. So the answer is yes, people do have to look at them, and it's not a very nice job, and they go through quite a lot of staff as a result of that. But what they're doing, they have an exemption under the Sexual Offences Act because of the legal answer is that that's the exemption which they have, and police officers who are looking at it for the same reason have a similar exemption. And basically, that's the way that side of the house works. The IWF also deals with other illegal material, and there's not very much of that. There's racist material. The difficulty there is it's very difficult to judge what is racist material as an expert. The general consensus is you only know it's racist material when a court says so, and there hasn't been enough judgments in order to form an independent view as to what would be judged correctly that way. And finally, there's talk of adding things chiefly called extreme pornography, which is people strangling themselves and that sort of thing, to that list as well. So that's the way that sort of side of the house works.
Richard, thank you. Is there anybody who happens to be here from BT or would care to come on this from their angle? Always the case, or often the case in these conferences, that the right person is in the room, but perhaps not at this moment. Moving on to another question.
Hello there. My name's Dan McQuillan. I work at Amnesty's International Secretariat. I'm actually here today in a personal capacity, and I've got a two-level question. One is directly to OpenNet Initiative, and one is a general question to everybody here, really. The first one, very specifically, is if you guys are going to be able to expand your analysis to things other than web pages. I particularly think about a great example from backstage.bbc, some folk around that innovation who were pushing out Persian news headlines from the BBC through an IM bot. And I'm quite interested in how other forms of internet tool can be used to bypass censorship and what the censorious regimes might want to do about that. So that's my one sort of direct level to people who really know stuff. My wider point is about the sort of, obviously, or perhaps not obviously, but I'm very interested in the campaigning potential for this stuff. I'm interested in the analysis because I want to do something about it. I want to be part of doing something about it. The two levels from that is, there was a kind of hint in some of the speakers that this process, the Pakistan example is very particular, can be politicizing in itself. People don't realize the internet is censored. Once they do realize it, maybe they feel some of those people want to do something about that, whether it's advocacy or more practically. So this seems to me great material, even to start doing that. So very specifically, I'm wondering how we can spread that material more. I'm even thinking sort of on a very basic level, like the data you've got, opening that out, open APIs, the data, any of that kind of stuff. But in general, how to visualize this stuff. And broader than that as well, nascent within the OpenNet Initiative and particularly within the Citizen Lab, there's the concept of the Siphon tool and so on and so forth. Is like, this is kind of action research, isn't it? Such a dynamic area that part of being involved in that, well, for many people here, perhaps not for all, would be that we don't think this is really a good thing. That the slippery slope is something that we don't think we should be going down. So at the same time as analysing it, are we also generating ideas to counter it?
Thank you. A hydra-headed question, but
Sorry about that.
No, it's great. All excellent points that we hope we've discussed over the course of the day. The very last one on the extent to which the tool makers are doing action research, there will be this afternoon a breakout session. I'd urge you to attend that. Hal Roberts and a number of the developers of those tools will be there. The second to last one, which we should open as well, the sort of notion of a campaign, that would be also a great one in this discussion, but in the afternoon to talk about what the point of having these two sets of working groups is in fact to work together on that explicitly. On the substantive first question as to will we expand the filtering beyond simple HTTP GET type requests, Professor Deibert maybe?
Yeah. Again, it's one of those questions you're dead on about. The tests that we undertake here check accessibility to simple websites, but what we're most interested in and what matters in a lot of the cases that we're investigating are non-traditional ways of accessing the internet and communicating, especially cellular networks and SMS, especially during events that I talked about, elections, mobilizing demonstrations, and so on. We're finding increasing evidence that cellular networks are being tampered with. That raises a whole new set of technological, methodological challenges for the OpenNet Initiative that we're embarking on now. We're beginning to investigate. And I would add to that list, going beyond just checking accessibility to websites, to actually running services from within countries, voice over internet telephone, for example, or a tool like Tor, for example. The map is evidence of this. I'd just like to single out our designer, Jane Gowan, who helped put together the map here. We're looking at ways to visualize our research, to make it more effective to convey what it is that we're conveying here, to reach a wider audience, and that's very deliberate, I would say. So.
Can I jump in for once? I was just going to say that some of the other areas that we are looking at and have looked at are things such as search engine filtering. So for example, Google removing particular websites from their search engines around the world, as well as looking at blog hosting providers. We've also looked at the filtering, keyword filtering in Skype's text chat from their Chinese client and so forth. So we definitely want to continue working in that area.
I want to just as a sort of matter of response to that, one of the things that's important to note is doing this level of work that we've done cost over $1 million, and 18 months or 5 years and about 100 people to do this. There are some completely wonderful funders who have supported us in this, the MacArthur Foundation, IDRC, the Ford Foundation, Vera France, and the OSI, and others to get to this level. So we have a scale issue, which is even doing this level and then being able to do this repeatedly is a substantial operation, requires a lot of real expertise. And yet we keep hearing comments like this, that there are really important ways to expand this work. Surveillance is clearly one. Different kinds of applications of the sort of, as I mentioned, SMS and so forth, making it useful to people who are activists using the internet to promote democracy. We need to be able to track other things. So I think one of the big challenges for everybody in this room, with us included, is how in many ways do we distribute the work of this research and then the work also of the advocacy. And I'd love to focus on that in the afternoon sessions to the extent people are willing, and say, if we were to put tools in the hands of other people, if we were to provide access to forms of the data. Our new website just launched last night includes a place where you can submit a URL for us to test, for instance, and tell us where to and so forth. So getting more interactive in Web 2.0 about it, and really trying to distribute the work, I think, is a key next step for us.
Sorry, I'd just like to say I wholeheartedly want that, and I apologise if my enthusiasm made me seem ungrateful. This is fantastic.
No, well appreciated. Thank you. Professor Evans.
I'm Hal Abelson from MIT. I think you've partially answered my last question. What are you doing to try to ascertain that the pages that are being served inside the country are actually the pages that are coming from outside the country?
This sounds like a nerd question.
Nothing really at this point. What we do is find blocked content and determine how it's being blocked, and then check lots of websites for that known behavior.
Because, you mentioned Google as the famous example, but there have been stories of various government information offices actually putting up bogus pages for their citizens.
Yeah, I would like to see data collected on that, and then I could try to test for it.
Tell about Kazakhstan. Didn't we follow up a report of that in Kazakhstan at some point?
Well, there was a case in, actually what we can track are redirections. And there was a case in Uzbekistan where there's a particular forum in Central Asia that's quite popular with the government criticism community. And what they did was, instead of blocking the forum, they made all of the long URL paths to that forum redirect back to the front page. So you could always get to the front of the forum, but you couldn't actually read any of the posts. That was the most wild case that I've actually seen.
We'll go to Ralph, and then we'll try to get out of
John,
the first two rows.
follow up on
Very
that
briefly,
question?
would be great,
Yep.
just because there's a lot of good questions.
Another thing we did to test whether anything like that was happening was we set up the people inside the country with a list of URLs we suspected to be blocked, and also gave them an anonymous proxy, Siphon in this case, and then they could compare side by side what it's like getting it by Canada and what it's like getting it through the country. And as far as I know, we didn't find any evidence of different websites being served up.
Ralph, and then we'll go to the two gentlemen about halfway up.
Ralph Schroeder from the OII. I guess my question is tending towards the qualitative side, but I'd be interested to find out. I mean, you've looked at this very much from the perspective of the plumbing and of the kind of, how you measure this and have the tools. What about if I'm a very determined user? I mean, if we take the user perspective, and I'm a religious or political dissident in a country, and I really have a lot of workarounds. I've coordinated with people that there's some kind of samizdat, if you like, publication in the country. How do you measure that?
I'll pass it on to Nart.
It's difficult to measure. What we, from a plumbing point of view, test for is the availability of the circumvention tools. But I think from an anecdotal perspective, it's a big decision for users to take to potentially break their country's laws and access content that could get them into trouble. It's even worse if they publish. Our colleagues at Human Rights in China, for example, track legal cases. And although we haven't seen that being used as a charge against people, an explicit charge, there is some evidence that it may be starting to be used as, further evidence that this person was up to something no good. So, I mean, there's a risk for people involved in making that decision. So while it's technically easy, when I go to Tunisia or wherever, I can get uncensored internet, no problem. But the penalty for me doing so is probably a lot less than a local activist there. But in terms of how that information travels, it's difficult to assess. Some of the information that we've come across are that in some countries, while the amount of internet usage is particularly low, it can be rebroadcast, for example, on radio stations, so that the radio hosts will read news sources online and then rebroadcast that kind of information over other mediums. That's probably the most interesting case of that information spread that I've seen.
I think there's an important big point behind Ralph's question that I take to be sort of a methodological question as well, which is to say we can explain the technical forms of filtering, but we also have to realize that this is about people seeking to access information sources. So I would say at least 50% of the research that's embedded in this and in a book coming out by MIT Press in the fall called Access Denied, which we've collectively written, is trying to provide that context from the perspective often of the user. Ron has vast expertise in studying hacktivists and others who use the internet as a network to do their work. We're very concerned about the human rights community and the way it's able to do so. And so coming at it from that human perspective, understanding where those blockages lie and putting the technical in context, I think is a really important thing to bear in mind. Sir.
My name is my name is Hossein Darakhshan. I edit a website called StopCensoring.us, which is focused on internet censorship on Iran, and where I'm from. I have actually two questions. One is that, have you done any comparative study between the legal system, especially when it comes to press law in those countries, and the policies that the censorship is being based on, because the overlaps between them is not that significant, where the areas that is not covered by the law would be more significant in that sense. And then the second point, which could be also a criticism, is that you are kind of overlooking or ignoring another type of censorship, which actually has caused many of these many of these filtering softwares to emerge. For example, secure computing, which is making a lot of money out of selling this software, is basically selling this software to huge corporations. And what the huge corporations do is that they restrict information for their employees at least for 8-9 hours a day. For example, if you work in a big company, like a big bank with maybe hundreds of thousands of employees, you would be actually more restricted. The number of hours that you are restricted, you access restricted internet is actually more than the number of hours that people like in small countries like Cuba, internet users there are behind the restricted internet. And this is something that I think it has to be taken to this kind of study, because it's a very important part of censorship. So we have 3 justifications. One is corporate, which is about productivity, but no one talks about that. And then it's security, and then it's morality.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Rob Faris on this one, but just as an immediate response, obviously very few people have done as much as you for freedom of expression, around the world. I'm hugely grateful to you for that and for those comments and for your help in this work. I would say it's unfair to say we've ignored corporate filtering, for instance. I think one of the key points here is that what we're able to test and to describe in the empirical research here is a very small subset of what filtering is. The goal in many ways of research is to set this into the context of the laws that you suggest, but also the many levels on which filtering occurs. So Ron made this point initially that the filtering happens at the backbone level sometimes, at the ISP level sometimes, at the cyber cafe level sometimes, at the home level sometimes, at the corporation level and so forth. And some of the reasons why we don't keep the United States and places like that completely in the blank up here is because there's lots of filtering all around the world happening in lots of ways. The fact of the matter is we aren't testing for that within each corporate network, but I think it is totally essential to put it in this overall package that says information is restricted at many levels in many times by many ways. Rob, do you want to respond to the legal sort of matchup question?
I'll give a weak response to that. Yeah, I just do want to say one other thing about the corporate level filtering is that the focus of this work is necessarily narrow in this first year on what we've been calling government mandated or government sponsored filtering. That's a very fuzzy line, and where to draw that is debatable even within the ONI researchers. But it's something we would love to expand upon, and it falls within the category that John mentioned before. There's a lot of things to do. We'd love to do them, but we'll have to figure out how to engage more people in the process and to carry that out. The legal side, each one of the country summaries that's available on our website has...
Which is OpenNet.net for anybody who's actually on the OpenNet at the moment.
It has a summary of the legal provisions for filtering as we understand it in each one of those countries. I wish I could summarize that in a few sentences, but right now it's kind of a cloud. I will say that people often refer to the role of rule of law in internet filtering, and the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of countries that are strict filters of the internet who are well within their legal rights by the laws that are in place in those countries, and that it's not a 2 or 3 or even 4-dimensional issue, and how to describe that accurately is a problem for us still.
I would say 2 things from a lawyer's perspective in response to before going to this gentleman's question. One is, I think you're right, your instinct does suggest that there's not a one-to-one correlation between those places with restrictive press media laws, for instance, or restrictive telecommunications laws also have either on the books internet filtering laws. There basically are none that are explicitly talking about internet filtering, some cybercrime legislation and otherwise. So very often it's undocumented as a legal matter, and very little correlation there. And secondly, that many places that have media laws that are very restrictive, or media environments that are also don't do filtering at all. So some of the most interesting results in this survey, I think, are Russia, Algeria, and Egypt. These are places that have clearly quite restrictive legal and other environments. Singapore would be another example. And there's very little, if any, internet filtering. So there's not a one-to-one correspondence either between the law and what happens, or the law in other areas and the law or practice in this area. Sir?
I'm Ed Foote at the University of North Alabama in the United States. The first time that I encountered the term filtering was in a 99 or 2000 book from the Computer and Telecommunications Board of the National Research Institute in Washington. And they talked about filtering, but they also talked about walled gardens. And of course, AOL was an example, it still is a good example, but less so, of a walled garden. And there were other instances of ISP suspected filtering. Now, what I'm concerned about here today is that we need to think about the terminology, and up there in the purple is the United States, and that might represent a walled garden. But then we take China doing other kinds of filtering, political particularly, and it's filtering. And can we adjust the terminology to cast a better idea on what the purposes are? I've walked around London a lot, and I've seen lots of walled gardens, and the people inside love them, and I'm on the outside and I hate them.
Sort of like Oxford. Rob, did you take this one?
Again, I'll try a weak response there. I think that terminology is problematic, and one of the things that we've hoped and strived to do in this study is to document filtering in a neutral and objective way as we're able to. And one person's walled garden is another person's prison. And what we have done is try to separate the content objectively into the different political categories and the different social categories, and leave it up to people such as yourself to interpret the good, the bad, and the ugly from that.
I'd like to turn also to my colleague, Professor Zittrain, who's got a book coming out called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, who has thoughts on this walled garden question.
Yeah, my worry is actually that we're going to ask for a walled garden, that there'll be a number of factors that what make internet surfing right now a bit of an adventure. You get a lot of the unexpected. There's some whimsy and fun to that, but we're relying on the internet more and more for so-called mission-critical tasks. We want to get the stuff done that we want to get done. And we actually see a convergence, I believe, between the prevalence of malware, spyware, what people see as dangers out there that really are going after them, phishing attempts, things like that. Walled garden architectures are very appealing as an alternative to that. And we see them now. If you love your BlackBerry, you like walled gardens. And I know sometimes you can surf on your BlackBerry. I know John is tethered to his BlackBerry. But that's a great example of something. Yes, and we've seen, I mean, we talked a little bit about how we're trying to also keep an eye on SMS filtering and other forms, other modalities of filtering. These are walled garden technologies that are really good at combating spam. You don't get a whole lot of SMS spam compared to what you probably get over email. And that's because there are intermediaries that are much better able to shape the service. It makes it cleaner, it shaves off the sharp edges, but it also feeds into an architecture of control that makes it much easier for somebody to say, no SMS over this weekend in the lead up to the elections, in a way that you really couldn't do so easily with the net. Yes.
Yeah, so that's messy.
Yes.
There's some great geeks I can tell up in the back. I'd love to start at the back with some geek questions, maybe.
In the first geek, Dmitry Vitaliev from the Tactical Technology Collective. Just wanting to ask if in your testing you have noticed, first of all, the most popular filtering software, and perhaps countries sharing different technologies of filtering, or possibly passing them down as they upgrade their own technology.
No, you're the expert on this one. Well, I would say that the most popular is just blocking IPs and routers. You can do that with any router. We didn't look specifically at what kinds of routers that people are using. So the most common exact or very similar setup was the smart filter net cache setup that we see a lot in the Middle East, North Africa region. In terms of technology transfer, you hear a lot, for example, about China transferring technology to other countries, but I haven't seen any other countries that, for example, filter by keyword the same way that China does.
So there have been suggestions that Vietnam is downstream of China, for instance, in terms of the network, if not the technologies. And we had a discussion of this yesterday. How do you respond to the suggestion that perhaps Vietnam is either taking Chinese technology or even its network services? And Uzbekistan for sure, and the Russian network.
I think it's possible as a horizon issue that countries could contract out their filtering requirements to upstream providers, for example. But in terms of the way in which countries filter, ISPs, one of the ISPs in Vietnam, for example, was just doing simple DNS tampering, nothing compared to China's keyword filtering. I mean, it's possible, but on the other hand, one of the things I've suggested, this is my personal opinion, is that if China were to export its filtering technology, it's giving a very big, secret part of their information control strategy to a lot of other people who could potentially leak it. So I doubt that they would probably want to do it, maybe in a consultation capacity or something that wouldn't show up in technical testing, but to just transfer their technology that they hold so dear and secret to other countries would then probably lead to more leakage about exactly how it works, which is something I don't think they would want to do.
We're absolutely going to study this as it goes forward. As Nart put it, we think of it as a horizon issue. We think there's bits of evidence potentially of this, but nothing that's conclusive enough for us to say it's actually happening. I wonder if the microphone's up there. Ethan, would you, can I give you the mic for 1 sec to talk about Sub-Saharan Africa for a moment? Because I know there are also suggestions that this might be happening in some of the states that you work in carefully.
Can I just say the microphone is for the recording. It doesn't sound like it's working, but it's important to use it so that the recording sounds good.
Thanks. So speak up and talk into the mic. Thank you.
I think part of what's going on in a sub-Saharan African context is less direct filtering at a technical level and more sort of speculation and intimidation that this filtering is on the way. And the story that I often find myself telling about this is the Zimbabwean story, where if you go into Zimbabwean cyber cafes, everyone will tell you that the Chinese have been over in Zimbabwe setting up filtering networks. We've run tests in Zimbabwe, and there's no good evidence that there's filtering taking place. But the perception that filtering is taking place is just as important. And in many cases, that perception is perhaps the easiest and least expensive way to actually put filtering in place. At the same time, I think one of the other questions to raise is that this is an extremely dynamic map, and if this map had been drawn 2 or 3 years ago, it would look very, very different than it does now. And I think we can reasonably expect it to look very different in 2 or 3 years. One of the factors that has to be considered in thinking about how this map changes is net penetration over time. And a lot of the countries that we've seen find their way onto this map are countries that have experienced either fairly high net penetration or high growth in net penetration. And so one of the things that we might be seeing in the sub-Saharan African environment is as that changes, and as we start cresting critical levels of crossing from 2% to, say, 10% penetration, you may see governments actually bothering to filter rather than simply saying that they're filtering.
Thank you. That's great. And as we go to Janet, just one tiny follow-up on that. In the last month, we did our 3rd election monitoring effort. Stephen Murdoch did a lot of the technical work for it. some wonderful people went on the ground in Nigeria to determine whether or not there was election related filtering happening. And we didn't find any evidence of it despite a fairly lousy election overall, as people know. But one of the things that came back from that research is, yeah, it's 1.1% internet penetration. Why do it now? So I think, as Ethan suggests, there are lots of horizon issues, and frankly, sub-Saharan Africa is one of those big horizons in the literal sense. Janet, and then we'll come back down to Vera.
Janet Haven from the Open Society Institute. I have two questions, one small specific question for Nart and one larger question that possibly is too early to ask. But Nart, you mentioned that the ISPs in Pakistan had leaked the blocked sites, and I wondered if you could just say a bit more about what you meant by that. Did they leak them specifically to ONI or in general, and sort of what was the intention behind it? And my second question is about the impact of these studies on the countries. In other words, have you gotten any response to this from the countries that you have been studying? And have you even gotten any kind of sort of positive response in the sense that they were blocking in a very crude way and they would like to be better blockers?
Never too early to ask that.
And if so, how would you respond to that?
That's great. And I think that to be very into Richard Clayton's too, which was talking about when you're studying something, how do you know if you're affecting it, maybe Heisenbergian to some extent too. As we answer, maybe Kathy, we can bring down to Vera, that'd be great. Margo, that was directly to you, and then maybe some of us would like to respond on the second one, which I think is provocative and important.
I got scans of the faxes from a Pakistani journalist. So I assume they were leaked to the media by the internet service providers.
Ron, on that second one, you take a lead.
Yeah, that's how we're planning on funding the next round of research, by consulting to refine it.
How to filter effectively.
It's a growing market.
Hey, well.
But yeah, quite seriously, I mean, the impact is mixed depending on countries that you're talking about. In some cases, early on in our research, not in this latest round, we did have a very tangible impact in some cases where countries realized they were overblocking because of using commercial filtering software as a result of our reports, and then changed the error as a consequence. It's a really interesting area to look at. It's very complex because you're looking at the impact of your research, and the reason that we're all involved in this, I think, as much as we try to keep our work impartial, is that we have a strong interest in human rights worldwide, and we want to raise transparency and accountability about these issues. And so I think in terms of our own research, the impact, maybe not so much on particular states as it is on citizens within those countries, especially human rights organizations who realize the envelope within which they're communicating how this is affecting them, and also citizens outside of those countries, for example, particularly in the United States, who now see the extent to which products made in their country are being used in the Silicon Valley parts of the United States. We used to associate some of these companies with wiring the world and connecting people worldwide. Well, now some of them are doing the opposite, and citizens in the United States are asking whether that's a good thing and what can be done about that. And I see that as a very tangible impact of our research.
I'd love to answer it as well myself in two parts, and then we'll get the next one to Vera. The first one is, Janet, I think at the core of this research, the hard question, or at least the hard one for me, is do we believe that there is such a thing as good internet filtering, right? So take the Saudi example, for instance. This is a country that does not release the internet, and how do you define that, but to its people until it determines that it can block all the porn, right, just for argument's sake, in 2001, whatever it is. So put in place the ISU, a relatively transparent website you can go to. It's Arabic and English. You can suggest a site to be blocked. You can suggest a site to be unblocked. Query as to this question of how you know that it was a bad site, so forth. But in that context, if more people get internet, for instance, more activists get internet because the state believes it can release it in a way that's limitedly filtered. Now, the Saudi example goes away once you realize how much they're blocking, how they're doing it, and so forth. But is there a version of that, and are we driving toward that? Do we want to be in a situation in which we are helping countries filter well? And that, I think, may be one of the questions that actually divides us. I have no idea what Ron normatively thinks on this, but I take the fact that we may reasonably disagree as to how this ought to play out. Second one, just to note as a follow-up to Ron's, one of the big extensions of this work that we've been doing at the Berkman Center, along with Dunstan, who's here, and many others, is working with some of these technology companies. Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Vodafone in particular have stepped up to say, we know we are required to participate under local law in these filtering regimes to censor or to carry out surveillance. How do we do that ethically? Now, most of these companies have been clobbered in the US Congress and in the press and so forth, and are stepping forward to say, we'll work with these 26 NGOs and others to try to come up with a set of principles. Hopefully Colin McClay and Dunstan and others will get this done, and we will. But I think that's a second area in which this very live question comes out. If you are a multinational technology company based in the West who wants to do business in one of these places, can you do business ethically while participating in these regimes? And if so, what does that look like? I think it's really the core part of the question.
Just, John, one quick sentence on that again. The slide I had up where I talked about all of the local partners that we have involved in the OpenNet Initiative's research is very important, because what happens in our collaboration is that we learn a lot from these local partners, and the exchange is two-way. They are, after the research, I think, better equipped to engage their own governments in public policy. And whether citizens in one country decide it's good to filter or not, I don't know how I feel about that, but I am glad to see where there is better knowledge, better informed people taking these issues to their governments and pressing for whatever changes that they want. And we do see very tangible impacts in that way in countries where we have the most extensive networks. And I would point to Central Asia as a good example of that, where I think we've been very effective.
There's no small thanks to the Open Society Institute that we have such a network. Vera, you're up next.
Yeah, I'm Vera Franz from the Open Society Institute. I have a very specific, actually small question, but it relates to Russia. That here shows us no evidence. We work with a lot of human rights groups and independent media in Russia, and they heavily complain about censorship, and it's particularly relevant as important elections are coming up. And what they report is the biggest problem for them is that there is hacking of sites and changing of content on sites. And I just wondered, they ask us, and certainly will ask ONI in the upcoming elections, is there a way to monitor these sorts of...
We will monitor the Russian election, right? One way or the other.
Right, but it might be that, again, on your map it shows there is no filtering, and so that next level, how can we capture that one?
Just a quick asterisk that's actually on there. There is an asterisk on Russia.
In your handout, if you flip to page 3 where we have the list of all the competitive you see the asterisk down there saying we didn't test it all.
We only tested in Moscow. And of course, in Russia, there are hundreds of internet service providers across many different time zones. It's an incredibly challenging country, just technologically to test in, but politically as well. There are some sensitive issues around testing there that are a challenge for us. So we will be actually testing extensively in Russia. I don't know how much we want to actually talk about the detail, but Nart on the denial of service.
I generally differentiate between sites that are filtered, so they're blocked for a particular ISP or a particular country's citizens or a particular ISP's users, versus sites that come under attack through denial of service or defacement and are then inaccessible for everyone. So we try to track those kinds of things if they do come up, but currently, because of the way that the testing is, that would have to be a fairly quick response before the site gets restored, or to have access to the server logs to see what kind of attack it is and so forth. Also, to differentiate between sites that are just targeted opportunities for people who do site defacements, or sites that are just altered a little bit to say something different or politically motivated defacements.
I think in some ways your question may be a variant of the same, which is there's lots of filtering that happens, even technically or otherwise, that doesn't show up in this map. I think one of the real challenges, particularly if we're forward here, we channel this. The CIS is a region in which the kinds of attacks that we're seeing are much less standard, like let's block a page and put a block page up there. That isn't the mode, with the exception really of Uzbekistan, you know, and where there may be other stuff. So we face a real challenge in the CIS. Fortunately, we have in some ways our best network there to try to uncover this, but this is a fair and good question that we have to keep grappling. Down the road here, sir.
Hi, my name is Shubha Mahmood from BBC Monitoring. Just a quick couple of questions. One is really just personal curiosity, and the second is...
People here in the back?
No.
Is there a way to dial up the volume, or is it only feeding to the camera? Can we dial up the volume so that people can speak and be heard?
I can shout.
It's only going to the camera.
Oh, you can shout. It's a little better.
This is the BBC world changing. Come on, stand up. Speak to the geeks. We love the geeks. Come on, make it great.
Shubha Mahmood, BBC Monitoring. Just two questions. We've been hearing a lot about filtering and how it's done, and all the software and where it's being done. But I guess what I really want to know about is why it's being done. I know you talked a little bit about the contextualization, the political and social aspect, but really what's going down to it? We all have an impetus to express ourselves. Why are states stopping it? And secondly, you talked about remote PCs in countries. How do you ensure that they'll be secure? Will they be in embassies or in secure networks? Could you talk a little bit more?
I'll definitely turn to Jonathan on the second of those questions. Rob, do you want to talk to the first, the why question, other than buy our book from MIT Press when it comes out in the fall? We're making no money on it. A royalty-free deal.
Keep pointing questions at me that I can't answer. That's a
That's
very
what
good.
you're there for. Nobody else wants.
I want a couple softballs out of this.
We need some plants in the audience. Think about
There's as many answers to that as there are questions, and I don't know. You probably know as well or better than I do. I think that in some circumstances, the answers to these questions emerge from long, intense debate within legislatures and along with judicial intervention. In some cases, it's the administrator checking the boxes and filtering. In some cases, it's coming down from the leader of the country saying, block that site. And so there's not one answer to it. It's generally a combination of all of the above. In the best of worlds, it would be a reflection of the consensus of the society as to what's acceptable free speech and what is not. There's of course no one answer to that. Thank you for the question.
It's a good question. One of the reasons that Jane helped us design the map in this way, which is to show political, social, conflict, security, internet tools, is to try to get at the question to some extent, which is, can we learn a little bit about why people did by virtue of what they do, and then can we, by virtue of understanding some of the political context, get to that. Yes, but I want to get to Jonathan too.
Just a quick comment. When we look at the information environment at our organization, we tend to look at it also from anthropological and socio-psychological perspectives, put it into that kind of context as well. So
yes. Plainly right and necessary. Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
I was just going to say, just on for each of our, we're focusing a lot on the technology, but our reports for each of the countries have quite detailed social, political, economic contextualization around it. So I encourage you to dive deep into this.
We love more anthropologists to work with us on it. Professor Zittrain on the second question.
Well, I was actually going to crack the first question, which was, as Rob was suggesting, authoritarian doesn't mean monolithic. So there may even be competing ministries within a given state that one wants to see it open up because their job is to get the economy going or whatever, and another one, their job is to safeguard a conservative element, or their job is simply, as you say, to tick the boxes. I mean, it's instructive that at Oxford, Skype was banned for a while, and the ban emanated from staff. It wasn't some great decision, or it's not some decision made that Skype is inappropriate or consumes too many network resources. It was literally, as I understand it, staff interpreting a general maxim that says you're not supposed to devote network resources that you've been granted as being part of the Oxford community to others. Said, oh wait, Skype has some peer-to-peer elements to help get around the American Address translation, and therefore Skype is banned. And now Skype is no longer banned at Oxford after there was a chance to kind of digest. And you have to make a bunch of changes to it that no one does. But anyway, So we find that in a place like Saudi Arabia, as John was saying, they have the forms. I wish we could pull it up, but I'll bet that machine's not on the net yet. They have the forms you can fill out that say, please filter this website, please unfilter this website if it's wrongly filtered. And it's very upfront about it, and I think it's a lot of bark and not a lot of bite. They, I think, are trying to reassure conservative elements, look, here's all these pages where we discuss our filtering, where you can ask to have sites filtered, and then they don't go out of their way, as best we can tell, to filter deeply in a lot of areas that aren't already set by some of the Western firms they're working with to do the filtering. In China, it's sort of been the opposite. You still can't get a straight answer from some elements of the Chinese government as to whether they filter. And believe me, some of the corporations that want to do business in China that simply want to know what bureau they go to get permission or to say, we're going to let this happen but not this happen, is this okay with you guys? There's nobody to talk to. They don't know who to talk to about it. It's BF scare conditioning. Like, you just do something and then you either get a shock or a pellet of food appears. And it is a way of training somebody, but it's more like a... Yeah, it's very true. So anyway, it is all to say, motivations, I think, can run the gamut. It can be done at sort of the staff level. It can be done to maybe appease the right wing in order to still let the thing in, or it can be done as an instrument of policy. And I think one of the great things we hope to do as our study gets panel data and we go year after year, is actually to figure out how quickly blocks change on particular topics, how much they're really maintained. Is it bureaucrats that kind of are making that government try, which is to say not much of one, or is it truly an instrument of policy and they are rushing to plug leaks as it appears in particular kinds of information? I forgot to say that.
The second question was about network security, but it seems... Stephen?
You can talk about that. In a lot of cases, the machine we use for testing is the researcher's own laptop. So we've got some assurances that that has not been compromised. In the case of the black box, we delivered that by me taking the train to Heathrow and then passing it onto our tester, and then them taking it and basically not letting it out of their site. But also we have other mechanisms. One of the reasons that this study took so long and so many resources is this is not a purely technical test. We do automated testing, but before then we get a list of what we believe the sites to be blocked. We then run the testing. If they don't match up, then we do more manual interaction. Once we get the testing list, every one of those results is validated manually. So if there's any interference with the results, there's multiple points that will hopefully catch it and manually establish what the actual true answer is.
Sir.
Thank you. My name is Osman Gündüz. I am from Azerbaijan. Certainly for me, very bad lesson about filtering Azerbaijan internet. No, I think we have also problem, no filtering internet. I think you have some old information. Lately, Azerbaijan internet in Azerbaijan development. No, we have stronger problem, other problem. Now in Azerbaijan, on the internet, on the content, not filtering. No, we have strongly government monopoly. Strongly government monopoly. In Azerbaijan, 35 internet provider for connection global network use one company, one internet company, only one backbone. No, we have that this problem for Azerbaijan greatly than filtering. And I think this is problem for countries which weak democratic transition. I think I am representative civil society sector. No, we last year we have only one blocking process. This is no political filtering and filtering about, I think, economical or social. And we fight against this, and we fight government with blocking process. Thank you.
Thank you. Nagar, any short responses to that, please? You know, obviously we love your help.
I think you have old information, no new information.
The problem, well, not a problem, but as I mentioned earlier, there's significant variation across the internet service providers. So in Azerbaijan, I think we tested, I don't remember exactly how many, but around 5 or 6 ISPs, and only one of those actually filters. And they filter a small amount of basically pornography. But more recently, there's been more reports of things as what Vera was mentioning, defacements and other kinds of attacks, as opposed to filtering. And sometimes we hear reports of sites being temporarily inaccessible. That it's difficult to determine in those cases whether or not it's intentional or not. So that's one of the issues that we face when we try to move this information up to a macro level, is that there may be very significant variations within the country itself. So for Azerbaijan is a good example where there's one internet service provider that's getting them on the list.
We have time probably for maybe 2 more questions. I suspect some people will be eager to have this break. So if you want to do, we'll have a final plenary.
Hello, I'm Sami Bourabia from Global Voices.
Sami, grab the microphone. I thought you were talking. Sorry.
I'm
Take away your boss, right?
No, it's fine. It's fine. Go right ahead.
He's got a better voice than you.
Yeah, sure.
Sami Bourabia from Global Voices Online. I'm also a Tunisian activist and blogger. I would like to ask a question about a quick understanding of if the site is blocked or no. 1 month ago, Tunisia blocked access to dailymotion.com, its video sharing site, and then we did develop new tools for O3 access denied checker to understand if the site is checked or is blocked or no. So I would like to raise the question about how activists should do to understand the blocking process in their country if they didn't have the torture tools.
And actually, I want to build on this because unsurprisingly, it's basically the same question. And this builds on the fact that you guys are now doing more and more sort of short-term event-based filtering. One of the things that we're finding as activists in the field is that blocks are coming on very, very rapidly and might only last a few days or a few weeks. They can be very, very difficult to validate through the ONI methodology of sort of doing a thorough country study. It's great if these blocks happen to happen around an election and you've already got monitors in place. But Fiji, for instance, appears to be going very aggressively around bloggers right now due to some sensitivities during a military coup. The block of Dailymotion in Tunisia appears to have been a fairly brief and fairly short block. Activists are very concerned with getting newspaper stories out, sort of documenting that this filtering is taking place. On the other hand, sort of historically, the ONI analysis process has dealt very, very well with countries like Saudi Arabia that sort of block it and keep those blocks in place for years. How is ONI going to adapt to this different environment and sort of allow activists in individual countries to sort of check their own filtering situation?
I'll turn to my colleagues, and then I want to use this as a segue to the break and to discuss the breakout sessions, because the answer to your question in part will be a change in the breakout session. So, Ron, maybe?
I'll just respond by saying there is a trade-off between accuracy and efficiency. And when we're doing the tests that we do and reporting what we report, we find that the more we know about how to do what we do, the more we realize the limitations of our understanding. And early on in the research that we did, we may have reported things actually in error because we didn't really understand what was happening. The case that you talk about is interesting in and of itself because although I don't know the full extent of what went on there, my understanding is that the Dailymotion video site, the video streaming site, was was blocked, and it turns out that it may have been a consequence of the commercial filtering product that was used. It was later unblocked. So in that case, a quick reaction might have said, it's the government doing this, when in fact it was the byproduct of the commercial filtering software. So there is a trade-off between being accurate and being efficient. You have to take some time to go through and report in an accurate way what it is that we're doing. Now, is there a downside to that? Of course there is. Right? It takes some time to do what we do effectively. But I think in the long run it benefits everyone by having people take some time and do things carefully. I would say, however, that all of us here participate in informal networks where we actively work with people on a day-to-day basis. I can sit here and give you detail after detail if you want of the number of times people contact us at the Citizen Lab, and there are many people in this room who know about that, where we do that type of rapid response to the best of our abilities. But we're a small shop. We only have limited personnel. We've got a lot of activities on the go, so it's not always easy to meet those demands, but we do our best. But the bottom line is this accuracy and efficiency trade-off that you have to recognize when you're trying to do something that brings some credibility to reporting on instances of internet filtering.
Thank you. So I'm going to take a pause there. It's 11. I apologize to those who have hands up. It's a wonderful, wonderful